Hello, back again on the Top Recap channel. This time I will tell a movie's entitled Cell 211. Let's get straight into the storyline. The story begins by showing a man named Juan Oliver. That morning, he is taken on a prison tour because tomorrow is his first day as a warden. Juan is shown the process of new prisoners entering the prison, as well as the layout of the building. His new colleague Armando explains that the place is generally divided into two sides. Side A is for ordinary prisoners, while Side B is for those convicted of extraordinary crimes, such as murder, terrorism, and so on. Armando also explained that the prisoners are clever. They can make weapons from simple items like spoons, shoelaces, etc. In fact, they once invented a weapon that looked like a catapult but was made of iron pipes. Essentially, they wanted Juan to be careful during his time here. Armando even emphasized that Juan should not look scared in front of the inmates, as they would not hesitate to use him. In the middle of this serious conversation, Juan's head was suddenly hit by a roof that collapsed due to renovations on the upper floor. His head was injured badly enough to make him fall unconscious. Panicking, Armando tried to lay him down in the empty cell number 211. This is where all the chaos began, because shortly before the accident occurred, a warden named Julian was getting ready to transfer a prisoner named Malamadre. As soon as the bang was heard, Julian reflexively went to Armando to make sure everything was okay. But then, Malamadre broke free and took the key to the prison door. As a result, when the door was opened, all the prisoners in Cell B immediately started a rebellion. Meanwhile, Juan was left in the cell because Armando and his colleagues escaped. Fortunately, the prison has several gates, so the inmates could not escape immediately. However, due to this incident, all the inmates escaped from their respective cells. Juan woke up from his stupor after being slapped by a prisoner who appeared to have mental disabilities. The prisoner continued questioning Juan's origins, which he regarded as a new prisoner. Sensing something was wrong, the prisoner immediately reported his findings to Malamadre. The warden was shocked when he discovered that Juan was left behind in Cell 211, but what could he do? At the same time, to avoid becoming the inmate's target, Juan immediately hid all his belongings, wallets, rings, belts, and all items that could not be owned by the prisoners he immediately threw away or hid in a safe place. Soon after, the prisoner returned and forced Juan to come with him. The prison actually kept some weapons that could be used by the guards in a precarious situation like this, but the problem is that they are not trained to use them. Moreover, if forced, the inmates might manage to snatch the weapons from them. Therefore, the prison director chose to ask the SWAT team for help. At this point, Juan was brought to Malamadre for interrogation. Amazingly, despite being surrounded by dozens of inmates and heavily interrogated, Juan could remain calm and answer all questions correctly. Thankfully, the head wound also led people to believe that Juan was a new inmate who had just been beaten by the guards. By pretending like that, at least the inmates wouldn't look down on him. However, Malamadre seemed to want to show who the real prison master was. He asked Juan to take off his clothes, leaving only his underwear. The problem was that Juan wasn't wearing any underwear because when he went to work, he couldn't find any clean underwear in his closet. As a result, he had to show everyone his little gun. Every cell in the prison is fitted with CCTV. However, since the riot started, the inmates began destroying them. Cleverly, Juan suddenly told Malamadre that they should leave one CCTV to be used in negotiations. If the guards couldn't see inside the prison, they might just send in the SWAT team. The idea was immediately welcomed by Malamadre. Meanwhile, the guards monitoring the CCTV earlier realized that Juan had successfully disguised himself among the inmates. From then on, the prison director ordered that Juan's identity be kept secret so his cover would not be blown. It turned out that besides Juan, one more warden was also trapped as a result of this incident. That person was Julian. That afternoon, Malamadre invited one of his men to take revenge on Julian, who was considered to have often tortured him in the past. Because his hands were handcuffed, Julian could only surrender to the situation that happened to him. Meanwhile, Juan can't do anything for fear of his cover being blown. Long story short, the SWAT team finally arrived at the location. They began to take their respective positions. However, Malamadre then issued an ace card where it turned out that there were 3 special prisoners in prison. They were former rebel troops who were deliberately kept alive so that they could be interrogated. The lives of the 3 of them were invaluable to countering terrorism. Upon realizing this, the SWAT team leader chose to wait for orders from a negotiator named Ernesto. Ernesto actually felt something strange. How could Malamadre know 3 special prisoners were in the cell when they had just been transferred? He thought that some guards had deliberately leaked it to the prisoners. To find out who the traitor was, a warden named Utrilla began investigating. Meanwhile, Juan, considered an expert in writing, was asked to record a list of demands from the inmates. Apparently, all these riots occurred because they had been treated like animals by the prison management. Hence, their needs are actually very simple. For example, they asked to be visited by their families every 2 weeks. They also requested that sick inmates be taken seriously because, so far, if they were ill, the warders just let it go. In fact, before Juan came, a prisoner in cell 211 died by suicide because he could not stand the brain cancer that kept tormenting him. Long story short, Ernesto finally communicated with the inmates through a walkie-talkie. He was invited to enter the riot scene to take the list of demands that Juan had written. On the other hand, 2 of Malamadre's confidants were unhappy with Juan's presence because he quickly managed to win over his leader. From then on, they planned to watch Juan's movements. Not long after, Ernesto entered the scene of the riot. Juan was ordered to search him. As this was happening, Juan secretly whispered where the terrorist prisoners were being kept. After the list of demands was submitted, Malamadre also requested that the police provide a lunch of 40 kilograms of shrimp for all prisoners to eat and Coca-Cola as a drink. Here, we can see that Malamadre really cares about his members. In fact, when Ernesto was about to leave, Malamadre suddenly called him back and asked that Juan be allowed to call his pregnant wife. For Ernesto, this was an opportunity to take Juan out. Unfortunately, as soon as he was about to be taken away, there was a sudden sound of a riot. Ernesto was detained while Juan was ordered to ascertain what was happening. As it turned out, there was a fight between the inmates that resulted in one of them being killed. The problem was that the guards thought it was one of the hostages, so the SWAT team immediately got ready to break in.
Atención todos los equipos, vamos a entrar.
Juan, who saw the situation, immediately went downstairs to take the 3 hostages. Although his decision was considered presumptuous, in the end, Juan managed to convince people to bring the 3 hostages to the front of the CCTV. Thanks to this action, the SWAT team did not go inside. Malamadre was secretly rather annoyed with Juan, who was considered to have made a decision without his consideration. However, Juan's mistake was forgiven because the situation was in their favor. On the other hand, news of the chaos inside the prison eventually spread. Juan's wife, Elena, realized this and tried to call her husband. However, her phone went unanswered. Shortly after, she received a call from Armando, who tried to explain that Juan was fine but was currently unable to receive calls. Of course, hearing such an explanation made Elena even more worried, and she decided to come to the prison. Meanwhile, Utrilla is torturing a prisoner who happens to be seriously ill and is being treated in the prison clinic. Utrilla's actions are beyond reason, as if he forgot that prisoners are also human beings. Armando tried to stop him, but it made Utrilla even more violent. Finally, because he couldn't take it anymore, the prisoner said that they got all the information about the terrorist prisoners from the prison barber. On the other hand, while having lunch, Malamadre bumped into a prisoner who had committed murder earlier. Because of his actions, almost all of their plans failed completely. However, while that was happening, Juan secretly took Malamadre's walkie-talkie, which he had happened to leave on the dining table. Malamadre didn't realize he was missing his walkie-talkie because he was busy watching TV and reporting on their actions. Some TV stations even covered the families of the inmates, who seemed worried about the condition of their families because, until now, the police had not explained what was really going on. Meanwhile, Juan informed Ernesto about the prisoner's location and asked that he be rescued immediately. But, strangely enough, Ernesto is planning something else. Soon, Malamadre finally realizes that his walkie-talkie is missing, but luckily, Juan arrives just in time to tell him that he found it on the dining table. The problem is that Malamadre's right-hand man, Apache, has secretly monitored Juan's movements. Elena finally arrives at the prison gates. Despite being heavily pregnant and jostling with hundreds of other inmates' families, she is determined to get inside so she can find out about her husband. Not long after, the sound of an ambulance could be heard. Everyone rushed to intercept the car to find out who they were carrying. It turned out to be the prisoners who had been tortured by Utrila. However, as a result of this incident, the families of the prisoners became increasingly restless and decided to commit anarchist acts. As a result, there was a fight between the residents and the police guarding outside. The problem is that Elena is caught up in the situation. Juan finally realized that his wife's life was in danger after seeing the news on TV. He panicked and begged Malamadre to lend him his walkie-talkie. However, instead of stopping the fighting outside the prison, Ernesto focused on cutting off the TV signal the inmates were watching. That way, they would no longer be able to see what happened to their families. Meanwhile, Elena, who was trapped in the crowd, was hit by the officers and fell unconscious. Moments later, when the chaos had subsided, Malamadre demanded that the guards hand over a list of those injured in the incident. In particular, he asks for news about Elena, but Ernesto tries to hide the truth and says everything is fine. Sensing that something was wrong, Juan tried to get news about his wife through the news on the radio. However, Apache suddenly appears and blows Juan's cover. Fortunately, he only thought Juan was a prisoner who had been promised parole as long as he cooperated with the authorities. Therefore, Apache asked to be included in the agreement. Here, Juan lied again and said that if Apache wanted to join, he had to help him find the latest news about Elena.
Tú y yo vamos a hacer un trato.
On the other hand, the prison director immediately called Utrila into his room to be fired. It turned out that he was the officer who had beaten Elena to death. Meanwhile, Juan went back to see Malamadre. Surprisingly, despite being a former criminal, he seems to be the only person who tries to comfort Juan in his anxiety. In fact, Malamadre gives him some tips so that his prison term can be cut and Juan can reunite with his small family soon. Not long after, Malamadre's members came to hand over a list of names of the people injured in the incident. But strangely, the list only contained 4 names, which meant the warders were trying to hide the truth. They get angry and plan to kill one of the hostages to show their seriousness. Fortunately, Juan managed to stop them by saying, it's better to cut off his ears and hand them over to the guards. That way, their threatening message will still get through. But, in return, Malamadre asked Juan to do it himself. Shortly afterward, Juan was again called to face Malamadre in an underground room. He was terrified because he feared the Apaches had blown his cover. However, it turned out otherwise. Secretly, Malamadre asked everyone to find out Elena's news. Apache managed to get hold of the TV station footage, where Elena was beaten by Utrila.
Dijeron, es esa la Elena, ¿no?
Utrila, who was about to leave the prison gates because he was fired, was suddenly recalled at Malamadre's request. People didn't think the inmates wanted revenge because Malamadre only said they wanted Utrila to be the new negotiator. As soon as the warden took the bait, Malamadre pulled a knife on him and forced him to go downstairs with him.
Se lo lleva al sótano por la escalera.
It was here that the warders realized they had been set up. Utrila was immediately brought to Juan for interrogation. Here, he could no longer contain his emotions and became violent. Fortunately, Malamadre stopped him. They asked the warders to be honest about Elena's condition.
Juan, Elena no va a poder hablar contigo ahora.
Here, Armando tried to argue that Elena was fine but couldn't speak because she was under anesthesia. However, the smart Juan knew that a pregnant person could be sedated unless the pregnancy had already been terminated. Finally, with a heavy heart, Armando told him everything. As it turned out, Elena died along with the baby she was carrying. All the inmates were furious and planned to kill Utrila on the spot, but the action was stopped because suddenly he dismantled Juan's disguise. Of course, he did this to save himself. However, Juan suddenly slashed his throat using broken glass. Moments later, there was an argument between Malamadre and his confidants. They had said, what if Juan really is a warden? But the funny thing is, here, Malamadre, who already believes in Juan, defends him. At the same time, Juan himself was planning to commit suicide using a belt. However, the plan failed, and he was left devastated. In less than 24 hours, he lost his wife and child. Plus, he was now a murderer. Shortly after, the government sent a new negotiator. This time, they planned to comply with all of Malamadre's requests because the terrorist group he was holding hostage was very valuable. But the problem was that Juan suddenly appeared with Utrila's body in the middle of the negotiations. He immediately says he's the killer and threatens to do the same if the government doesn't disband the prison. There were hundreds of inmates who died as a result of the chaotic system, and the government should be held accountable. Therefore, Juan threatened to kill the hostages if, within the next hour, the government did not immediately announce the dissolution of this prison on TV stations. Juan's idea was considered brilliant by the inmates. They cheered with joy. Even Malamadre could no longer contain his actions. But of course, Malamadre immediately vented his emotions once behind the scenes. Indirectly, Juan had taken over his leadership. However, Malamadre did not deny that Juan's idea was genius. Therefore, he chose to punish him at a later time. However, one problem had not yet been solved, and Malamadre suddenly had to face another. That afternoon, Ernesto called him to the side of the gate. It turned out that the prison had decided to stop Juan's disguise. They felt that Juan had gone too far in killing Utrila. Therefore, Malamadre was ordered to kill him. In return, Malamadre would be released next year.
Esto es un truco, hijo de puta. Esto no es más que un papel y una mierda.
Malamadre then held a small meeting with his two trusted members. Of course, they were very upset when they found out Juan was a warden and suggested killing him right away. But on the other hand, Malamadre felt that the prison was running out of ideas, to the point of telling them to kill Juan. Therefore, Malamadre decided to continue with the plan and postpone the execution. However, Apache was cynical about the decision. Long story short, a few minutes before his demands were fulfilled, Malamadre talked to Juan and blew his cover. Although deeply disappointed by the facts, Malamadre continued with the plan they had built. He even entrusted Juan with a knife that he could use to kill the prisoners in case the SWAT team suddenly broke in. At the same time, Ernesto suddenly managed to get information about where the prisoners were being held. He ordered the SWAT team to get ready to take action. Not long after, their demands were finally fulfilled. A TV station reported that the prison would be disbanded and all those responsible for it brought to justice. However, simultaneously, the Apaches suddenly betrayed and killed all the Malamadre members guarding the prisoners. Shortly after, the SWAT team also fired dozens of tear gas canisters into the prison. Amid the panic, Malamadre and Juan planned to kill the prisoners in cell 225. But the problem was, Apache was already on guard there, even secretly shooting at Juan from afar with a gun. Malamadre had no idea that Apache would betray him. In fact, even he was not spared. His face and body were badly wounded by the gunfire. Once the prisoners realized that Juan and Malamadre had been overthrown, they ran away. Meanwhile, the SWAT team finally broke into the building through the roof. As a result of this incident, several inmates died. One of them was Juan. Armando did not expect that his future colleague would die on his first day of work. Meanwhile, Malamadre survived and was immediately rushed to the hospital. This is also where we find out why Apache was suddenly betrayed. As it turns out, Ernesto is the mastermind behind all this chaos. Secretly, he offered freedom to the Apache as long as the lives of Juan and Malamadre were taken. All that Ernesto was forced to do was so that the prisoners could be saved.